The Public versus Autistic Tony Stark by ajexists. Chapter 4. Everyone's a little autistic. Tony ended up shutting down the rest of the day. When Pepper came home, she saw him curled up on the couch. The weighted blanket they recently got was wrapped around him, and he was blankly staring at the coffee table. She ended up comforting him the rest of the night. He couldn't talk until the next morning. When he told her what happened, she wrapped him into a hug, reassuring him that he wasn't that word, and that the teen was an immature arsehole who needed to learn a little respect. She was right, of course. Pepper's always right. Pepper then suggests a date night. Go out to a restaurant and enjoy their time together. Doesn't have to be anywhere fancy, just somewhere where we can have a lovely meal and enjoy each other's company. How does that sound? Tony smiled. Sounds nice. Pepper rubbed his hand with hers. I have time next Saturday. Tony smiled again and nodded. It's a date. The next Saturday rolled by. The two decided to go to a local Italian restaurant they both liked for the date. It wasn't a high-class fancy restaurant, but it wasn't cheap either. The place was owned by Italian immigrants and is now run by their children. They serve real, high-quality Italian dishes that remind Tony of his mother's cooking, one of the few things that remind him of home. Even though it wasn't a fine dining restaurant, they still wanted to dress nice. Tony decided on a grey button-up shirt, a black blazer with some black pants, simple yet sophisticated. As he was combing through his hair, Pepper came into the room wearing a red dress. Tony saw her through the mirror and flushed. He put the comb down and turned to face her. Well, now I feel underdressed. Pepper chuckled. You look fine. She walked over and ran her fingers through his hair. Handsome, even. Tony smiled, rubbing his fingers together. You look beautiful, as always. You flatter me. She leaned in to kiss him, then grabbed onto his hands, allowing him to stim with them. They stand like that for a few seconds, then Pepper asked, Ready to go? Tony smiled and replied with a nod, which made Pepper smile. Let's go then. Tony drives them to the restaurant, which, even with NYC traffic, is only about 15 minutes away. He parks the car and the two head in the restaurant. Once they get seated, a waitress almost immediately comes over. She appears to be in her mid-20s and says, Before anything else, are you Tony Stark and Pepper Potts? Tony and Pepper smiled and nodded. Pepper verbally answered by saying, Yes, we are. Oh my god, that is so cool. The waitress smiles wide. Well, my name is Emily, and I'm very honoured to serve you two. Anything I can get you two for drinks? Tony glances up at her and says, I'll take a coffee and an ice water. Just an ice water for me, Pepper replies. I'll get those right in for you two. The two watched as the waitress practically bounced away. Pepper chuckled and reached over the table to hold Tony's hands. She seemed happy to see us. Tony chuckled as well. Yeah, maybe. He grabbed hold of Pepper's hands, once again stimming with them. Have I ever told you how much I love playing with your hands? Pepper glanced down at their hands and back up at him. Playing with my hands? I think a couple of times. No, I mean... Tony huffed and squeezed their hands, trying to figure out how to word his thoughts and feelings. I mean, after the diagnosis and everything, have I really explained it to you? Pepper thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. No, I don't think you have. Well, I really like it 'cause... Well, have I told you what stimming is? He glances up to see Pepper nod. Right, I like to use my hands a lot for stimming, and what I'm doing now is stimming. He raises their hands up to show her. And I really like stimming with your hands because, like, I love you, you know? And stimming with you just feels nice, like I'm... Tony sighed and let go of her, now rubbing his fingers against his palm. I don't think I'm explaining it right. I think I understand, Pepper smiles. You feel accepted? You feel like you can share a part of yourself with someone you care about? Tony nodded. Yes, that's exactly it. He went back to holding her hands. You always know how I feel. Not always, but I know you pretty well to have a rough estimate. Pepper smiled. She thought about it for a while, then said, You never really know, do you? What do you mean? You never really know how you feel. Sure, you can get basic descriptors like good or bad, but never in detail, you know? Actually, I do know now, Tony smiled, the kind of smile he gives when he's about to share some random fun fact or ramble on about something he enjoys. It's called alexithymia. It's when someone struggles to identify or describe what they're feeling. Oh? Yeah, in Greek it roughly translates to no word for emotions, and it can be connected to interoception issues. So I could feel a pain in my stomach and be like, is that anxiety or am I hungry? That's why people who struggle with this often describe their emotions with physical descriptors. Oh wow, that makes a lot of sense, Pepper replied with a smile. What does interoception mean again? Oh, sorry. It's the ability to interpret internal signals like hunger or going to the bathroom. Pepper raised her eyebrows. Is that why I have to remind you to eat and to go to bed? It is, Tony chuckled, looking away with embarrassment. I have pretty shit interoception. It's okay, honey. Now I know you can't help it. Right after the waitress comes back over with their drinks. Here you go, Mr. Stark and Miss Potts. Pepper was about to say thank you, but the waitress cut her off by saying, I heard you two talking about your autism. Tony and Pepper stare at each other. Pepper then looks at her. I don't see how that... You want to hear my honest opinion about it? Once again, Tony and Pepper were about to speak, but she cuts them off. I really do think that everyone's a little bit autistic. Tony bites his lip and glares down at the table. Pepper sees this and tries to say, Emily, ma'am, I don't think this is the time. I mean, you were talking about not remembering to eat. Sometimes I forget to eat. And small talk. Gosh, I may be a waitress now, but believe me, in my teens I was not good at it. She laughed. And, you know, everyone has hobbies that they're super into. I've been really getting into diamond art recently. That's not what it's like at all, Tony spat out. Pepper's eyes widened and looked over at him. Tony? The waitress looked confused. Oh, I wasn't saying there aren't other things you struggle with. I'm just saying that there are things everyone experiences that aren't just autistic struggles. But didn't you just say that you don't struggle with these things? You said sometimes you forget to eat. Sometimes. Tony? Sometimes you forget, but not every minute of every day, to the point where you need your AI and your girlfriend to remind you to eat because you've been so busy working on your next project and haven't left the lab in over 10 hours. Tony glanced up at the waitress. Oh yeah, those hobbies you were talking about aren't just hobbies. They are highly intensive focuses that you can focus so heavily on, it can cause you to forget to do all your basic human functions. Tony, I'm pretty sure she understands. And what was it that you said about small talk? Oh, I was bad as a teen. I'm goddamn near still 50, and I still struggle with it. Tony, Pepper shouted out, you're going to cause a scene. Tony suddenly remembered where he was. He glanced around the restaurant. People were staring at him. Some had their phones out. He couldn't take it anymore. He got up and bolted out of the restaurant. Pepper called out to Tony, but it was too late. She sighed and pulled out some cash. I apologise for his behaviour, but I will say your comments were not appropriate to say at all. She put the money down on the table. For the drinks. She left to go find Tony. She went outside and found Tony sitting curled up on the ground in front of the building. His eyes were shut and he was punching his leg. Pepper walked over and crouched down in front of him. Tony, sweetheart, please try not to hurt yourself. Why does this keep happening, Pep? Tony asked, his voice slightly cracking. He opened his eyes and Pepper could see tears forming. I can't go anywhere without someone making a comment about my autism. And why is it always so negative? Pepper sighed. I don't know, honey. She reached out her hand, inviting Tony to hold on to it if he wanted. I'm so sorry that it keeps happening, and I'm sorry that it happened during our date night. Tony accepted her hand, then mumbled, "It's fine." "It doesn't have to be." Pepper allowed him to silently play with her hand a bit more before saying, "I've already paid for our drinks. I'm assuming you don't want to go back in." Tony let out a shaky breath, then shook his head. "Yeah, I assumed so." Pepper let out a small smile. "How about we run through Burger King, then go back home and watch shitty rom-coms tonight?" Tony smirked, nodding and quietly saying, "I'd like that." Pepper smiled and kissed his head. "Great." She stood up and helped Tony get up. "I'll drive. Give yourself some time to relax." Tony sighed but nodded, getting in the passenger's side of the car. He wiped his eyes and tried to forget about what just happened, instead focusing on redeeming his date night. Pepper made it easier to forget. The shitty rom-coms helped too, and he will always love a good old Burger King burger. But he still felt bad the rest of the night. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Have a lovely day.